man with the world at his feet was about to lose everything that truly mattered. It would take the quietest person in his kingdom to show him the one secret he'd overlooked. In the hushed, sprawling hills of Northern California, where tech billionaires reshaped the world from glass-walled mansions, Walter Anderson was a king. His empire was built on predicting the future, on seeing patterns in data that no one else could. But the one pattern he couldn't see was the slow, silent erosion of his own family. He had a wife he no longer knew, a son who communicated through lawyers, and a daughter who treated his home like a hotel. His fortune was a fortress, but inside its walls, he was utterly alone. Then, one ordinary morning, he wandered into a forgotten room and discovered a child the world never noticed. She carried nothing but quiet hands, wise eyes, and a secret Walter was about to need more than anything. The morning air, thick with the scent of redwood and coastal fog, did little to calm the storm inside him. Walter stood before a floor-to-ceiling window in his minimalist mansion, a testament to modern architecture and cold, hard lines. Below him, the perfectly manicured lawns rolled down to meet a private vineyard, the grapes heavy on the vine, ready for a harvest that would become a wine worth thousands a bottle. He held a tablet in his hand, its screen glowing with stock tickers and market analyses. It was his shield, his language, the world where he made sense. Across the cavernous living room, his wife, Catherine, sat at a long, sterile dining table. She picked at a single slice of melon on a stark white plate. Catherine had been a vibrant artist once, her laughter a splash of color in a black and white world. Now, she was as curated and untouchable as the sculptures that dotted their lawn. Her silence was a weapon, honed over years of conversations he'd been too busy to have. "The Foundation Gala is tonight," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. It wasn't a reminder, it was an accusation. "You do remember." Walter didn't look up from his screen. "Of course. My speech is already written. We'll be honoring the new wing of the Children's Hospital." He said the words, but they were just data points on his calendar. Another event, another public performance of philanthropy. "That's not what I meant, Walter," Catherine said, her voice laced with a familiar, weary sadness. "It's our anniversary. 35 years. The stock tickers blurred. He felt a jolt, a system crash in his meticulously ordered mind. He had forgotten. Again. The algorithm of his life was so focused on future profits and market shares that it had deleted the most important data point of his past. He looked up, and for a moment, he saw the young woman he had married, her eyes full of a hope he had long since extinguished. "Catherine, the Tokyo deal has been," he began, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "There's always a deal, Walter. For 35 years, there has always been a deal." She placed her napkin on the table, a gesture of finality, and stood up. "I won't be at the gala tonight. I'm going to stay with my sister for a few days." She didn't wait for a response. She simply walked away, her footsteps a quiet, fading rhythm on the polished concrete floors. He was left alone with the silence and the glowing numbers on his screen, which now seemed to mock him. He had just successfully orchestrated a multi-billion-dollar merger, a feat of strategic genius. But he had forgotten his own anniversary. The king was a fool in an empty castle. Later that morning, his daughter, Jessica, breezed through the front door. She was a whirlwind of designer clothes and restless energy. She treated the house like a pit stop, a place to refuel and recharge before her next social engagement. "Dad, I need the black card," she announced, heading straight for his study. "There's a charity auction in Napa, and I saw a necklace that would be perfect for the gala." Walter looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in what felt like months. She had his eyes, but they were missing the fire and focus. Hers were bright but empty, constantly scanning for the next distraction. He saw a reflection of his own failure. He had given her everything money could buy, but he had given her none of himself. She didn't have a purpose, because he had never shown her one. "Your mother isn't going to the gala," he said, his voice flat. Jessica paused, her hand hovering over the credit card on his desk. "Oh, is she sick?" There was no real concern in her voice, only a flicker of annoyance that her plans might be disrupted. "No," Walter said. "She's leaving. For a few days." Jessica shrugged. "Okay, well, that's fine. We can still go, right? It's for the hospital. It's important for the brand." The brand. Not the family. Not US. He felt a cold, heavy weight settle in his chest. He had built an empire of brands and assets, and he had turned his own family into one. No, he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. We're not going. Jessica stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. He had never said no to her. Not really. But, I need that necklace. She stammered, as if that explained everything. You don't need a necklace, Jessica, he said, the truth of his own words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. You need a life, and I have failed to give you one. He walked out of the study, leaving her standing there, bewildered and angry. He wandered aimlessly through the cavernous house, each room a museum of his wealth and his loneliness. The art on the walls was priceless, but it gave him no comfort. The views from the windows were breathtaking, but they offered no peace. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the hallways of a beautiful tomb. He ended up in the conservatory, a massive glass atrium filled with exotic plants. It was the one room Catherine had designed for herself, a small pocket of wild, untamed beauty in their sterile world. He ran a hand over the leaf of a rare orchid. It was a complex, delicate thing, a living system that required precise conditions to thrive. He understood systems. He could predict the stock market. Why couldn't he understand the system of his own family? It was then that he heard it. A soft, methodical sound. A quiet clicking. In the corner of the conservatory, partially hidden by a giant fern, was a small girl. She was sitting on the floor, her back to him. She had a cascade of blonde hair, tied back with a simple ribbon. Before her, on a protective cloth, were the scattered, intricate parts of a vintage clock. It was an old, magnificent piece from his collection, a masterpiece of Swiss engineering that had stopped working years ago. He had hired 3 different specialists to fix it. All had failed, declaring it a lost cause. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He recognized her as the daughter of his maid, Laura. Laura was a quiet, almost invisible presence in the house, a woman who did her work with a quiet dignity and then disappeared. Her daughter, Emily, was even more so. He'd seen her from a distance, a small shadow doing her homework in a quiet corner while her mother worked. Now, that shadow was meticulously reassembling one of the most complex mechanical objects he owned. She wasn't playing. She was working. Her small fingers moved with an impossible, practiced confidence, using a set of delicate tools he had never seen before. She would pick up a tiny gear, study it for a moment, and then, with a soft click, place it into the growing lattice of brass and steel. He watched, mesmerized, for a full 10 minutes. He, the master of complex systems, was watching a child solve a puzzle that had stumped experts. She wasn't forcing the pieces. She wasn't guessing. She seemed to understand the logic, the language of the machine. It was as if she could see the blueprint of the clock in her mind. Finally, he cleared his throat. Emily didn't startle. She simply paused her work and turned to look at him. Her eyes were a calm, intelligent shade of blue. There was no fear in them, no deference. Just a quiet, assessing gaze. "Hello, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice soft but clear. "What are you doing?" he asked, the question sounding inadequate. "I'm fixing your clock," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He felt a surge of disbelief, followed by a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something else. "Hope." "How?" he asked. "The best horologist in the country couldn't fix it." She looked back at the clock, her expression thoughtful. "They were looking at the broken parts," she said. "But the parts aren't the problem. The problem is the space between the parts. They forgot to look at the relationship." She pointed with a small screwdriver to a minuscule gap between 2 cogs. "This one is fighting that one. They're supposed to work together. They've forgotten how." Walter stared from the girl to the clock, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He wasn't just looking at a broken machine anymore. He was looking at a mirror. He and Catherine. He and his children. They were all just broken parts, fighting each other, forgetting how to work together. "Who taught you to do this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. A small smile touched her lips. It was a sad, wise smile, a smile that didn't belong on the face of a child. "My great-grandfather," she said. "He was a soldier. Sergeant Michael Peterson. He fought in a war a long time ago. He said you can't understand a machine by looking at its pieces. You have to understand the map of how they all connect." She turned her startlingly blue eyes back to him. "He said the most important secret in the world isn't a thing. It's a map. And most people, they've lost it." She turned back to the clock and, with a final, gentle click, she placed the last gear into position. She gave a small will a tiny, tentative push. A soft whirring sound filled the silent conservatory. Then, for the first time in a decade, the old clock began to tick. The ticking of the clock was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the silent conservatory. It was a sound of life, of order restored. Walter stared at the small, blonde-haired girl, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. This child, Emily, hadn't just fixed a piece of machinery. She had diagnosed the sickness in his soul. The space between the parts, he repeated, the words feeling heavy and important. The relationship. Emily nodded, carefully wiping a smudge of oil from her finger with a small cloth. That's what he said. My great-grandfather. He said people are like that, too. They get so focused on themselves, they forget they're part of a bigger machine. A family, a town, a country. They start fighting the other parts, and then the whole thing just stops. She packed her tools away into a small, worn leather roll with the same quiet precision she'd used to assemble the clock. Each tool had its place. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation. Walter, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with the force of his will, felt an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. He had built an empire, but he had lost the map. This 10-year-old girl was holding it in her hands. Where did you learn all this? He asked again, his voice softer this time. A soldier. He taught you about clocks? He taught me about systems, Emily corrected gently. He was a radio operator in the war. He had to fix broken radios with whatever he could find. He said you learn a lot about how things are supposed to work when you spend all your time with things that are broken. Before Walter could ask another question, a woman appeared at the conservatory door. It was Laura, Emily's mother. She was a thin, tired-looking woman who always seemed to be trying to make herself smaller to take up less space. She held a worn cardigan in her hands. Emily, it's time to go, sweetie. You shouldn't be in here, she said, her eyes darting nervously towards Walter. She was afraid. Afraid for her job. Afraid that her daughter had overstepped, had broken some unspoken rule of this palace of glass and stone. It's quite all right, Laura, Walter said, his voice surprising him with its gentleness. Emily was just fixing my clock. Laura's eyes widened as she heard the steady ticking. She looked from the clock to her daughter, a mixture of pride and fear on her face. Oh dear. Emily, I've told you not to touch things that aren't yours. But it was broken, Mom, Emily said simply, without a trace of defiance. It wanted to work again. I could hear it. Laura just shook her head, a gesture of a parent who has long given up trying to understand the unique wiring of her child's mind. Come on. We have to catch our bus. Walter watched as Emily took her mother's hand. The small, confident girl who had just lectured a billionaire on the nature of systems suddenly looked like a child again, small and vulnerable. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he couldn't name. It was a feeling of loss, of a missed opportunity. Wait, he called out. They both stopped and turned. He fumbled for what to say. He wanted to ask her more. He wanted her to explain the map, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself saying, Laura, from now on, please have my driver take you and Emily home. Laura stared at him, speechless. In 5 years of working for him, he had never said more than a handful of words to her. She simply nodded, unable to form a reply, and led her daughter away. Walter was alone again with the ticking clock. The sound was no longer just a rhythm, it was a countdown. Each tick was a second of his life, a second of his family's life, that he was wasting. He walked over to the clock, a magnificent piece of brass and mahogany, and placed his hand on its side. It felt warm, alive. For the first time in years, something in his house felt alive. He walked out of the conservatory and back into the cold, sterile expanse of his home. The silence that greeted him was different now. It was heavier, more profound. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of absence. The silence of broken connections. He found Catherine in their bedroom suite. She had a suitcase open on the bed and was methodically folding clothes into it. She moved with a calm, detached efficiency that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a calculated departure. Catherine, he said, standing in the doorway. She didn't look up. If you've come to tell me the Tokyo deal is more important, you can save your breath, Walter. I wasn't going to say that, he said, stepping into the room. He felt like he was entering a foreign country without a passport. I forgot. I'm sorry. There's no excuse. She paused, a silk blouse in her hands. She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a deep, bottomless exhaustion. No, there isn't. But thank you for not making one. She went back to her packing. This was the moment where he would normally retreat. He would offer a gift, a trip, a piece of jewelry, a transaction to smooth things over. It was the language he knew. But Emily's words echoed in his mind. They forgot to look at the relationship. He didn't offer a gift. He tried to offer a piece of himself. I was in the conservatory, he began, his voice hesitant. The old clock. The one we bought in Switzerland on our honeymoon. It's working. Catherine stopped packing again. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. What? Who fixed it? Laura's daughter. Emily. The maid's little girl? She asked, incredulous. Yes. He took another step into the room. She said the parts weren't broken. She said the problem was the space between them, that they'd forgotten how to work together. He looked at her, hoping she would see the meaning behind his words. For a moment, he thought he saw a crack in her armor, a hint of the woman who had once loved his mind, his way of seeing the world. But then her expression hardened again. Well, she said, her voice brittle. Some things can't be fixed with a screwdriver, Walter. She closed the suitcase. The click of the latches sounded like a cell door slamming shut. I'll be back on Sunday. Please don't call. She walked past him without another word. He listened to her footsteps fade down the long hallway, followed by the soft, final click of the front door closing. He stood in the middle of their bedroom, a vast, empty space that was no longer theirs, but just his. The ticking of the clock in the conservatory seemed to mock him from a distance. One tick, another tick, a countdown to 0. He retreated to his study, the one place where he still felt in control. The numbers on his screens were a comfort, a world of predictable logic. But even they seemed different now. He saw not just individual companies, but a web of relationships. Suppliers, customers, competitors, an ecosystem, a machine. And he realized, with a dawning horror, that he had been so focused on the individual parts that he had missed the health of the system as a whole. An email popped up on his screen. It was from his son's lawyer. Michael, his only son, was a brilliant but volatile young man who had left the family company a year ago to start his own rival firm. They hadn't spoken since. Now, Michael was aggressively trying to poach one of Walter's key clients. The email was a formal, sterile declaration of war. His first instinct was to call his own legal team, to crush the rebellion, to win, as he always did. It was the only move he knew. But then he thought of a little girl with blonde hair and a sad, wise smile. They're supposed to work together. They've forgotten how. He picked up his phone. He scrolled past the number for his chief counsel. He found the number he hadn't dialed in over a year. He pressed the call button before he could change his mind. It rang 3 times. Then, a voice. Not his son's. A clipped, professional female voice. Michael Anderson's office. It's his father, Walter said, the words feeling strange. I need to speak with him. I'm sorry, Mr. Anderson is in a meeting. Can I take a message? Tell him. Walter started, then stopped. What could he say in a message? He closed his eyes. No message. He hung up the phone. He had tried to bridge the space, but the gap was too wide. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his kingdom pressing down on him. He had all the money, all the power in the world. But he was bankrupt in every way that mattered. His wife was gone. His daughter was a stranger. And his son wouldn't even take his call. The king was alone in his castle. And somewhere, in a small, cramped apartment across town, a 10-year-old girl was probably doing her homework, oblivious to the fact that she had just handed a dying man the one map that might, just might, lead him back to life. The next morning, the sun rose over Walter Anderson's kingdom, but it brought no warmth. The house was a mausoleum, the silence a suffocating shroud. He had not slept. He had spent the night in his study, the glowing screens of his empire pulsing in the darkness. But for the first time in his life, they offered no answers. They were just numbers, empty data points in a life that had lost its meaning. The ticking of the conservatory clock, which he could hear faintly even from his study, was a constant reminder of his failure. Tick, tock, another second gone forever. He was a man who solved problems. That was the core of his identity. He saw a market inefficiency, and he corrected it. He saw a logistical challenge, and he engineered a solution. Now he faced the greatest problem of his life, the complete system failure of his own family. And his usual tools, money, power, logical deduction, were useless. He kept coming back to the girl, Emily, the child who saw the world not as a collection of parts, but as a series of relationships. The problem is the space between the parts. Her words were a key, but he didn't know what lock they opened. He found himself walking to the kitchen, a part of the house he rarely entered. It was Laura's domain. It was spotless, organized, a model of quiet efficiency, much like the woman herself. A schedule was pinned to a small corkboard, written in a neat, precise hand. It detailed Laura's tasks for the week, and next to it, a bus schedule. He saw the time of the bus she and Emily took home each day. For 15 p.m. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9 a.m. He had a full day of meetings, of decisions that would affect thousands of people and millions of dollars. He was supposed to be on a conference call with his board in 10 minutes. He took out his phone. He called his assistant, a woman he paid a fortune to orchestrate his life down to the minute. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I have the board on the line for you." "Cancel it," Walter said. There was a stunned silence on the other end. He hadn't missed a board meeting in 20 years. "Sir? Is everything all right?" "Cancel all my meetings today," he said, the decision solidifying in his mind as he spoke the words. "Something has come up. Something more important." He hung up before she could ask any more questions. He felt a strange sense of liberation, of rebellion. For one day, he was stepping out of the machine. He was going to find the map. The hours crawled by. He wandered his empty house like a restless spirit. He saw his wife's absence in the perfectly made bed, her favorite teacup still sitting by the sink. He saw his daughter's indifference in the trail of expensive clothes she'd left on the floor of her room. He saw his own failure in every photograph, every painting, every object that filled the space where a family was supposed to be. At precisely 3:30 p.m., he went to the garage. It was filled with a collection of cars that would make a collector weep. Sleek, powerful machines, each a masterpiece of engineering. He walked past the Ferrari, the Bentley, the vintage Porsche. He got into the most ordinary car he owned, a simple black sedan he kept for inconspicuous trips into the city. He hadn't driven himself in years. The leather of the steering wheel felt unfamiliar in his hands. He drove to the end of his long, winding driveway and parked. He waited. He felt foolish, a billionaire hiding in his own driveway, waiting for his maid and her daughter. But he knew he couldn't summon them to his office. This couldn't be a transaction. It had to be something else. At 4:10 p.m., he saw them walking down the long path from the service entrance of the house. Laura was walking quickly, her head down, a woman who wanted to be invisible. Emily walked beside her, her pace unhurried, her eyes taking in the world around her. She pointed to a hawk circling high overhead, but her mother just pulled her along, anxious to get to the bus stop. Walter's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment of decision. He could stay in the car, let them pass, and go back to his empty life. Or he could get out. He got out of the car. Laura saw him first. A look of pure panic crossed her face. She thought she was in trouble. She grabbed Emily's hand, her knuckles white. "Mr. Anderson," she stammered. "Is something wrong?" "No, Laura. Nothing is wrong," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. He looked at Emily. She was watching him with that same unervingly steady gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity. "I was hoping I could speak with your daughter for a moment," he said. Laura's grip on Emily's hand tightened. "She hasn't done anything, sir. I promise. She's a good girl." "I know she is," Walter said. "She fixed my clock. She did something no one else could do. I want to understand how." He looked directly at Emily. "You talked about a map," he said. "I need you to tell me more about it." Emily looked up at her mother. Laura was frozen, caught between her fear of her employer and her fierce, protective love for her child. Emily gave her mother's hand a small, reassuring squeeze. "It's okay, Mom," she said softly. Then she looked back at Walter. "I can't tell you about the map, but I can show you." Walter was taken aback. "Show me? How?" "Come with us," Emily said simply. She gestured down the road, in the direction of the bus stop. "It's not far." And so it was that Walter Anderson, a man who flew in private jets and was driven in armored cars, found himself walking to a public bus stop with his maid and her 10-year-old daughter. Laura walked stiffly, a few paces ahead, still radiating anxiety. Walter and Emily walked side by side. My great-grandfather's name was Michael, Emily said, as if they were just continuing their conversation from the day before. He was very brave, but he said the bravest thing he ever did wasn't in the war. It was after, when he came home. Why was that? Walter asked, genuinely curious. Because everything was broken, she said. The world was broken. The people were broken. He was broken, and everyone was trying to fix their own little piece, but they were making it worse. They were all fighting each other, just like the gears in your clock. They reached the bus stop, a simple wooden bench under an old oak tree. A handful of other people were there. Landscapers, housekeepers, construction workers. The people who kept his world running, the people he never saw. They all recognized him. They stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Walter Anderson, waiting for the bus. He felt a flush of embarrassment. His instinct was to stand apart, to assert his status. But he looked at Emily, who sat on the bench as if it were a throne, perfectly at ease. He sat down next to her. So what did he do? Walter asked, keeping his voice low. Your great-grandfather. He started building maps, Emily said. He got a job at the post office, delivering mail. It wasn't an important job, but he said it was the most important job in the world, because he got to see how everything was connected. He saw which houses got happy letters and which ones got sad letters. He saw who was friends with whom. He saw who was lonely. He delivered the mail, but he was really delivering the connections. He was reminding people that they were part of the same town. The bus arrived with a hiss of its air brakes. It was old and loud. Laura hurried Emily on, casting a nervous glance back at Walter. For a heart-stopping second, he thought they were just going to leave him there. But Emily paused on the first step of the bus and looked back at him. Are you coming? She asked. He looked at the bus, then back at his car, a small black speck at the end of his long driveway. It was his escape route, his way back to his world of power and control and profound, soul-crushing loneliness. He looked at the small girl with the impossibly wise eyes. She was offering him a different path, a different map. He got on the bus. He paid the fare with $100 bill, the smallest he had, telling the stunned driver to keep the change. He sat down in a worn vinyl seat next to Emily. Laura sat across the aisle, looking as if she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. The bus lurched forward, and Walter Anderson's world began to change. He was no longer a king in a castle. He was just a man on a bus, a broken part in a broken machine, hoping a 10-year-old girl could show him the way back home. The inside of the bus was a world Walter Anderson had only ever viewed from the tinted windows of his chauffeured cars. It was a cross-section of humanity, a rolling ecosystem of people whose lives were as foreign to him as a distant planet. A construction worker sat with his dusty boots in the aisle, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Two women, dressed in the uniforms of a local hotel, chatted in rapid-fire Spanish, their laughter a bright, musical sound. A young man with headphones on stared out the window, a textbook open on his lap. These were the invisible cogs in the great machine of his world. They cleaned the offices he owned, built the towers he financed, served the food in the restaurants he frequented. He was a king, but his kingdom was built on the backs of these people, and he didn't even know their names. He felt a profound, unsettling sense of shame. He looked at Emily. She was perfectly at home. She smiled at the two women, who smiled back, one of them asking about her mother in Spanish. Laura, still tense, offered a short, polite reply. Emily seemed to know everyone. She waved to the construction worker, who gave her a tired but genuine smile. That's Mr. Rodriguez, she whispered to Walter. He's building the new library downtown. He told me it's going to have a special section just for old books, the ones with the best smells. Walter just nodded, speechless. This 10-year-old girl had a deeper, more meaningful connection to the man building one of his philanthropic projects than he did. He just signed the checks. She knew the man's dreams. The bus journey was only 15 minutes long, but for Walter, it was a journey across a chasm. They passed through the manicured, tree-lined streets of his own neighborhood, a world of high walls and security gates, and into a different part of the city. Here, the houses were smaller, closer together. The lawns were not perfectly manicured, but they were dotted with children's toys and brightly colored flowers. People sat on their front porches. Neighbors called out to each other across the street. There were no walls. They got off the bus in a neighborhood that Walter's financial advisors would have described as economically disadvantaged. It was a place his companies avoided, a dead zone on his investment maps. But to Emily, it was simply home. "This is where the map lives," she said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. She led him down the block, not towards an apartment building as he expected, but towards a small, unassuming house with a peeling but cheerful yellow door. A wind chime made of old silverware tinkled in the breeze. In the small front yard, a vegetable garden grew in neat, tidy rows. "This is my great-grandfather's house," Emily explained. "We live in the apartment upstairs." He left the house to the neighborhood. Walter looked at her, confused. To the neighborhood? Before she could explain, the yellow door opened, and a man came out. He was old, with a kind, weathered face and hands that were thick and calloused. He wore a simple work shirt and jeans. He broke into a wide smile when he saw Emily. "There's my master mechanic," he boomed, his voice warm and resonant. He knelt down and gave her a hug. "Did you get that old Swiss monster working again?" "It wasn't a monster, Mr. Henderson," Emily said, laughing. "It was just lonely." The man, Mr. Henderson, looked up and saw Walter. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion and suspicion. He recognized Walter immediately. Who wouldn't? His face was on the cover of magazines. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice now cautious. He stood up, placing himself slightly in front of Emily, a protective gesture. "What are you doing here?" "He's with me," Emily said, stepping out from behind him. "I'm showing him the map." Mr. Henderson looked from Emily to Walter and back again. The suspicion in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of understanding. He nodded slowly. The map. "Well, come on in, then. You're just in time. The system's down." Walter followed them into the house. The inside was not what he expected. The front room was not a living room, but a workshop. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were not filled with books, but with broken things. A toaster with its wires exposed. A vacuum cleaner with its guts laid bare. A child's bicycle with a tangled chain. A vintage radio, its wooden case cracked. In the center of the room was a large workbench, cluttered with tools and spare parts. This was the map. It was a repair shop. "This was Michael's place," Mr. Henderson explained, seeing the look on Walter's face. "Your great-grandfather," he said to Emily. "After he retired from the post office, he started this. People in the neighborhood, they don't have money to buy new things when something breaks. So they bring it here. Michael taught himself how to fix anything. And he taught us." He gestured around the room. "I'm a retired plumber. Mary, she comes in on Tuesdays, used to be a seamstress. Young David, he's a wizard with computers. We all come here. We fix things. For free." Walter was floored. He, who lived in a world where everything was disposable, where the slightest flaw meant an object was discarded and replaced, was standing in a room dedicated to the art of repair. It was a foreign concept. "The system's down," Mr. Henderson said, pointing to an old, industrial-looking coffee machine on the workbench. "The heating element is shot. And in this neighborhood, a morning without coffee is a full-blown crisis." He looked at Emily. "What do you think, Chief? Can we save her?" Emily's face lit up. She was in her element. She dragged a small stool over to the workbench, climbed up, and peered into the machine's inner workings. Walter watched, fascinated, as she and the old plumber began to work. They spoke a language he didn't understand, a language of circuits and heating coils and electrical resistance. But as he watched, he started to see it. He saw the map. The coffee machine wasn't just a machine. It belonged to Mrs. Gable down the street, an elderly widow who lived alone. Mr. Henderson mentioned that she brought a pot of coffee to the bus stop every morning for the early construction crews. The machine was a part of a system of kindness, of connection. By fixing the machine, they weren't just fixing a broken object. They were repairing the fabric of their community. He looked around the room at the other broken things. The toaster belonged to a single father with 3 kids. The bicycle belonged to a little boy who used it to deliver newspapers. The radio belonged to an old man who listened to baseball games every night. Each object was a story. Each repair was an act of love. He thought of his own house, filled with perfect, priceless, and utterly meaningless things. He had a collection of vintage clocks, but he had no time. He had a fleet of cars, but he had nowhere to go. He had a state-of-the-art kitchen, but no one to share a meal with. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a series of notifications. A stock he owned had soared. A deal he'd orchestrated had closed. His net worth had just increased by another $50 million. The numbers glowed on the screen, but they felt like ashes in his hand. He looked up from his phone, from his world of abstract wealth, and saw Emily, her brow furrowed in concentration, her small hands carefully soldering a new wire onto the coffee machine's heating element. That was real. That was value. A 10-year-old girl and a retired plumber, working together to make sure an old woman could still share a cup of coffee with her neighbors. An hour passed. Walter didn't say a word. He just watched. He was a student in a classroom he never knew existed. He learned that the little boy's bicycle chain had been tangled because he'd crashed while trying to avoid a dog that belonged to the single father who owned the broken toaster. He learned that the radio was a gift to the old man from his late wife, and that listening to the ball games was his way of keeping her memory alive. He saw the threads, the invisible lines that connected everyone in this small, vibrant world. The space between the parts. Finally, Emily stepped back from the workbench. "Okay," she said. "Try it now." Mr. Henderson plugged the coffee machine in. He flipped a switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a small red light blinked on, and with a soft gurgle, the machine began to hum. A smell of brewing coffee slowly began to fill the small workshop. Mr. Henderson let out a triumphant laugh and lifted Emily off her stool, spinning her around. "You did it, you little genius. You saved the neighborhood from a caffeine-deprived apocalypse." Emily giggled, a bright, happy sound. It was the sound of a child, but Walter knew he was in the presence of an old and powerful soul. Mr. Henderson put her down and turned to Walter. His eyes were no longer suspicious. They were knowing. "Now do you see it?" he asked. "The map. It's not about fixing the things. It's about fixing the connections." Michael, he understood that. He used to say the whole world is just one big machine. And it's broken, but you can't fix it from the top down. You got to start with the smallest parts. With your neighbor's coffee pot. With a little boy's bicycle. He poured the freshly brewed coffee into 3 mismatched mugs. He handed one to Walter. "Welcome to the workshop, Mr. Anderson," he said. "The real work is harder than it looks." Walter took the mug. The coffee was strong and hot. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry, a king in a castle of glass and steel. But in that moment, standing in a small, cluttered repair shop, surrounded by broken things and the people who fixed them, he felt, for the first time in a very long time, like he was finally home. The ride back to his estate was a silent, surreal journey between 2 universes. Mr. Henderson had called a local taxi for him, a rattling sedan that smelled faintly of pine air freshener and old coffee. Walter had directed the driver to the spot near his driveway where he'd left his own car. As he slid back behind the wheel of his luxury sedan, the contrast was jarring. The plush leather, the silent engine, the hermetically sealed environment, it all felt like a beautiful, sterile prison. When he pulled through the grand, wrought iron gates of his property, he saw it all with new eyes. The sprawling lawns weren't a symbol of success anymore. They were a green desert, a vast, empty space separating him from the rest of the world. The mansion, with its sharp angles and vast expanses of glass, didn't look like a home. It looked like a corporate headquarters, a monument to a man who had forgotten how to live. He walked through the massive front doors into the echoing silence of the great hall. A single rose, perfectly arranged in a minimalist vase, sat on a marble table. It had been placed there by a florist he employed but had never met. It was a perfect, beautiful, and utterly lonely flower. In his mind, he saw the chaotic, vibrant vegetable garden in front of the little yellow house. This single, curated rose was his life. That messy, thriving garden was Emily's. His first instinct was to go to his study, to bury himself in the familiar comfort of work. It was the pattern of a lifetime. But he stopped himself. The study was his fortress of solitude, the place he went to hide from the very connections he now so desperately needed to repair. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, towards a part of the house he had avoided for years, Catherine's old art studio. When they had first built the house, this was supposed to be her sanctuary. It had the best light, a soaring ceiling, and a view of the distant ocean. For a few years, it had been a place of joyful chaos. The air had smelled of turpentine and clay, and the floors were perpetually spattered with paint. But as his empire grew, and his time shrank, the light in the studio had dimmed. The canvases were eventually covered with white cloths. The potter's wheel fell silent. Now, it was just a storage room for forgotten dreams. He opened the door. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light filtering through the grimy skylights. In the center of the room, under a ghostly white sheet, was her potter's wheel. He walked over to it and pulled the sheet off. It was a beautiful, solid piece of equipment, but it was caked with old, dried clay. The foot pedal was stiff, and the wheel itself wouldn't turn. It was broken. Another broken machine in his broken house. He thought of Mr. Henderson and the coffee pot. You got to start with the smallest parts. Walter Anderson, a man who moved billions of dollars with a phone call, knelt on the dusty floor of his wife's abandoned studio. He looked at the potter's wheel not as a symbol of his failure, but as a system of parts. A motor, a belt, a pedal, a wheel. A relationship. He had no tools and no idea what he was doing. But for the first time in his life, he was determined to fix something with his own two hands. He spent the rest of the afternoon in that room. He found a rusty toolbox in a forgotten closet. He slowly, carefully, began to take the machine apart. He laid each piece out on the floor, just as he had seen Emily do with the clock. He saw that the drive belt was cracked and brittle. The gears were clogged with a mixture of dust and dried clay. He worked methodically, cleaning each cog, each wheel, with an old rag. It was slow, frustrating work. He pinched his finger, got grease on his expensive trousers, and twice he almost gave up. But each time he felt the urge to quit, he thought of Emily's quiet confidence. They're supposed to work together. They've forgotten how. He wasn't just cleaning gears. He was performing an act of atonement. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear his daughter, Jessica, come in. What in the world are you doing? He looked up. She was standing in the doorway, a half-dozen designer shopping bags hanging from her arms. Her face was a mask of sheer disbelief. You're filthy. Are you okay? I'm fine, Jessica, he said, his voice calm. He turned back to the wheel. I'm fixing your mother's potter's wheel. Jessica dropped her bags on the floor. Fixing it? Dad, you can buy her a new one. You can buy her 100 new ones. Why are you covered in grease and playing mechanic? Her voice was sharp, laced with the familiar tone of impatient annoyance she used when the world didn't instantly bend to her will. This was the moment. The test. His old self would have snapped at her, would have lectured her about her spending, her ingratitude. But he wasn't his old self. He was a student of the map. He looked up at her, at his beautiful, lost daughter. He didn't see an entitled brat. He saw a broken part. A girl who had been taught that the only way to fix something was to replace it. A lesson he had taught her. Because some things aren't supposed to be replaced, he said gently. They're supposed to be repaired. She scoffed. Okay, what is going on with you? First you cancel the gala, then Mom leaves. Now you're acting like some kind of handyman philosopher. Did you hit your head? He took a deep breath. Your mother loved this wheel, he said, ignoring her sarcasm. We bought it together a long time ago. She used to make the most amazing things. Vases, bowls. Our first set of dishes. Do you remember those? The blue ones. Jessica's expression flickered. A hint of a memory, quickly suppressed. Vaguely. They were lumpy. They were made with love, Walter said, his voice soft with memory. And then, I got busy. The deals got bigger. We started buying things instead of making them. And this room went quiet. He looked from the wheel to his daughter. Our whole house went quiet. Jessica was silent. She looked around the dusty, forgotten room. He could see a war of emotions in her eyes. Confusion, anger, and something else. Something deeper. A sadness she kept well hidden. So what? She finally said, her voice defensive. You fix this stupid wheel, and everything magically goes back to the way it was? Mom comes home, and we all live happily ever after. No, Walter said. I don't know if I can fix this wheel. And I certainly don't know if I can fix us. But I know I have to try. You have to start with the smallest part. He held up the cracked drive belt. This is the problem, he said. This is what connects the motor to the wheel. It's supposed to be strong and flexible. But it got old and brittle, and it snapped. Without it, the motor just spins, and the wheel does nothing. All the power in the world, and it can't create a thing. He looked directly into her eyes. Sound familiar? Jessica stared at the broken belt in his hand. She understood the metaphor. She was smarter than he gave her credit for. He saw her jaw tighten, her defenses rising. That's ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Is it? He asked. He didn't push. He just let the question hang in the air. He turned back to the wheel. I need a new belt. I think I know a place where I might be able to find one. He stood up, his knees cracking in protest. He walked past her, pausing at the door. Jessica, he said, his back still to her. The things you bought today, the bags in your hand, will any of them matter in a year? In 5 years? She didn't answer. Will they ever make you happy? He asked, his voice full of a sadness that was not an accusation, but a shared sorrow. He walked out, leaving her alone in the dusty studio. She stood there for a long time, surrounded by her shiny new purchases and the ghost of a life she had never known. She looked at the expensive, empty bags, and then at the broken, forgotten potter's wheel. And for the first time in a very long time, Jessica Anderson didn't know which one was worth more. Walter drove the sedan back into the city, leaving his world of manicured perfection behind once more. He didn't use the car's sophisticated navigation system. He drove from memory, following the route the bus had taken, a new map being drawn in his mind. When he pulled up in front of the little yellow house, Mr. Henderson was sitting on the front porch, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the world go by. He saw Walter's car, and a slow smile spread across his face. He didn't seem surprised. Broke something else already? He called out as Walter got out of the car. You could say that, Walter replied, walking up the path. He held up the cracked, brittle drive belt. I need one of these. For a potter's wheel. Mr. Henderson took the belt and examined it with a practiced eye. Haven't seen one of these in a while. Old model. They don't make them like this anymore. He looked up at Walter. Good machine. Worth fixing. I know, Walter said. Might have something in the back that'll fit, Mr. Henderson said, getting to his feet. Come on. The archives are this way. He led Walter through the workshop and into a cluttered back room that was a chaotic library of forgotten technology. Shelves overflowed with motors, wires, gears, and belts of every conceivable size. It was a testament to a time when things were built to last, to be repaired, not replaced. As Mr. Henderson rummaged through a box of old rubber belts, Emily appeared in the doorway. She wasn't holding a set of tools this time. She was holding a schoolbook. She looked at Walter, then at the broken belt in his hand. A knowing smile touched her lips. The wheel in the dusty room? She asked. Walter nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The very one. It's a good machine, she said, echoing Mr. Henderson's words. It just needs to feel useful again. My great-grandfather said that's true of machines and people. Nothing breaks a spirit faster than feeling like you don't have a purpose anymore. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He thought of his wife, her art supplies gathering dust. He thought of his son, fighting him for a piece of the corporate world because he'd never been offered a meaningful role within it. He thought of his daughter, filling the void of her purpose with expensive things. And he thought of himself, a man with a vast empire and no real purpose at all, other than to make the numbers go up. Here we go, Mr. Henderson announced, pulling a black rubber belt from the box. This should do it. Strong, flexible, good as new. He handed it to Walter. No charge. Just the price of a good cup of coffee next time you're in the neighborhood. Walter held the new belt in his hand. It was a simple, solid object. It wasn't worth more than a few dollars. But in that moment, it felt more valuable than anything he owned. It was the part he needed to start the repairs. He thanked them both and drove home, the simple rubber belt sitting on the passenger seat like a precious jewel. When he returned to the studio, he found Jessica sitting on the floor, her shopping bags discarded in a corner. She was wiping the dust off an old, lumpy blue bowl with the hem of her designer shirt. It was one of the first things Catherine had ever made on the wheel. She looked up as he entered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usual mask of indifference gone. I remember this, she said, her voice quiet. We used to eat cereal out of these. Before everything. Walter's heart ached. He knelt on the floor beside her, the grease and dust no longer matching. He put the new belt on the floor between them. I think I can fix it now, he said. They didn't speak for the next hour. They worked together. He showed her how to fit the belt, how to tighten the screws. She cleaned the old clay from the crevices he couldn't reach. For the first time since she was a little girl, they were not a CEO and an heir, not a bank account and a supplicant. They were just a father and a daughter, working together to fix something that was broken. When they were done, he plugged it in. He pressed the foot pedal. There was a low hum, and then, smoothly and silently, the wheel began to turn. Jessica let out a small, involuntary gasp. She reached out and placed her hand on the spinning wheel, a look of wonder on her face. That was the scene Catherine walked in on. She stood in the doorway, her suitcase in her hand, her face a mixture of shock and utter confusion. She saw her husband and her daughter, both covered in grime, kneeling on the floor of her long-abandoned studio, their hands resting on her resurrected potter's wheel, which spun between them like a newfound star. "Walter," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. He stood up slowly. "Welcome home, Catherine," he said. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. We fixed your wheel." She looked from him to Jessica, and then to the spinning wheel. Her hard, polished armor began to crack. She saw the new drive belt. She saw the clean gears. She saw the effort, the care. It was more than he had given her in 20 years. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. He took a step towards her. "Because I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him nothing and giving him everything. "I've been so busy collecting things, I forgot how to build them. I've been so focused on the bottom line, I forgot about the lines that connect us. I lost the map, Catherine, and I am so sorry." He stopped, giving her the space. This couldn't be a hostile takeover. It had to be a merger. Jessica stood up and held out the lumpy blue bowl. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I remember this." Catherine looked at the bowl, then at her daughter's face, and the dam finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She walked into the room, set down her suitcase, and took the bowl from Jessica's hands. She held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The next day, Walter Anderson did something he hadn't done in a decade. He drove to his son's office. He didn't call first. He didn't have his assistant make an appointment. He just showed up. He found Michael in the middle of a heated meeting, planning his next attack on his father's company. When Michael saw him standing in the doorway of the conference room, he was stunned into silence. "We need to talk," Walter said, his voice calm and firm. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He took his son to a small, neutral coffee shop. He didn't talk about business. He talked about the potter's wheel. He talked about a little girl named Emily. He talked about a broken clock and the space between the parts. And for the first time, his son listened. He didn't see a rival. He saw a father, a lost, broken man trying to find his way home. It wasn't a magic fix. The damage of years could not be undone in a day. But it was a start, a repair, the beginning of a new map. That evening, Walter stood at the great window of his mansion, looking out at his kingdom. But he wasn't looking at the vineyard or the rolling hills. He was looking at the distant lights of the city. He knew that in one of those small, warm lights, a little girl was probably doing her homework. A girl who had fixed his clock, and in doing so, had shown him how to fix his life. He heard a soft sound behind him. The gentle, rhythmic whir of the potter's wheel. He turned. Catherine was in the studio, the lights on, her hands covered in wet, fresh clay. Jessica was sitting on a stool beside her, watching, a small, genuine smile on her face. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of creation. The king was no longer alone in his castle. He was just a part of a machine, a beautiful, complicated, and finally, working machine. The secret the maid's daughter had shown him wasn't a secret at all. It was the simple, profound, and often forgotten truth that nothing is ever truly broken beyond repair. You just have to be willing to get your hands dirty. You just have to remember to look at the space between the parts. You just have to find the map and have the courage to follow it home. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.